You are listening to the Objects of Affection collection. Study 48. Artisan Activism, Why Craft, Materiality and Protest Define Post-Luxury Value. The modern discourse surrounding art valuation is dominated by an anxiety rooted in abstraction. The fear that artistic merit has been entirely eclipsed by financial potential. The mechanisms that determine the price of contemporary art rely on perceived cultural value, provenance, and, most crucially, predicted future worth. This system operates on inherently vague indicators. It is highly susceptible to the intersubjective process of assessment and conferring of reputation by market experts, including critics, curators, gallery owners, and collectors. The resulting value is extrinsic and forward-looking, functioning not as a measure of inherent worth, but as a derivative of anticipated profit. The speculative horizon and the eclipse of intentionality. In this speculative economy, the prerequisite for making wise choices in collecting has shifted drastically. Historically, this wisdom was predicated on a passionate engagement with the art, requiring aesthetic discernment and deep knowledge. Today, however, market behavior prioritizes investment calculation over genuine connoisseurship. This inversion has profound critical implications, particularly when examining art that attempts to challenge prevailing economic and social inequalities. The art world itself serves as a microcosm for studying these broader economic forces, and consequently, art cannot be dissociated from the conditions of its own production and distribution. The inherent difficulty arises when critique intersects with the powerful institutions that embrace the very values it is based on. When art seeks to effect change or raise awareness, its critical intent is often neutralized upon entry into the commercial exhibition circuit. The system's capacity to absorb and monetize dissent means that even radical artistic positions are swiftly converted into market assets. The ultimate aspiration of speculative capital is to valorize itself indefinitely, operating as an automatic subject detached from the friction of labor or material constraints. When art becomes primarily speculative, divorced from ethical grounding, it risks becoming capital's flattering self-image, an object of financial manipulation rather than genuine social resistance. The conceptual debt, from dematerialization to financial abstraction, the historical trajectory of conceptual art sought to resist commodification by dematerializing the art object. Originating in the 1960s, this movement famously rejected conventional artistic ideas, prioritizing the philosophical concept behind the work over its visual or aesthetic qualities. This was an attempt to make art inalienable by removing the physical asset that the market could easily trade. However, the market, driven by its ceaseless capacity for abstraction, merely shifted its focus, commodifying the documentation, language, and performative ephemera that define the work. This pursuit of artistic autonomy, which attempted to exist outside the forces of exchange, paradoxically created an affinity with the core mechanism of speculative capital. The failure of dematerialization was its inability to escape this abstracting force. This intellectual history confirms that pure conceptual autonomy, while noble in its aspiration to resist, proves insufficient for resisting the market's totalizing reach. Critique, therefore, must be regrounded in the material world, returning to Adorno's observation that art must resist by its form alone the course of the world which permanently puts a pistol to men's heads. The post-luxury diagnosis, rejecting exclusivity for permanence, the recognition of the speculative market's philosophical failure directly informs the emergence of the post-luxury framework. Traditional luxury, relying on rarity, status appeal and materials, has become increasingly commodified and globalized. An observable trend among higher-income consumers, referred to as post-luxury, involves choosing not to upgrade to conventional luxury goods, particularly when those goods are not commensurate with the concept of true quality or authenticity. The process by which many luxury goods are made, and the value of the materials used no longer reliably support the promise of improvement over mass-produced items, leading to a decline in the income upgrade phenomenon. The inherent problem is a structural void in the modern luxury market, caused by the failure of mass-produced goods and the subsequent collapse of authentic narratives, as diagnosed in The Luster Restored. This void demands a framework capable of articulating value based on metrics that resist easy financial abstraction. The Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art, Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art framework offers a tangible answer to this problem, calling for a foundational shift away from consumption-driven models of exclusivity toward permanence, intentionality, and intellectual engagement. Establishing inalienable value, The Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art, Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art. Framework Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art redefines the relationship between art, luxury, and utility by strategically using the functional object as a site for philosophical and cultural critique. The framework moves beyond the traditional luxury definition, that of excess, rarity, or status, by situating value in depth of thought and enduring use. Defining post-luxury conceptual functional art, the rematerialization of critique. The founding premise of post-luxury conceptual functional art is the necessity of rematerializing critique. While conceptual art sought to shed the object, post-luxury conceptual functional art reclaims the functional item, be it a garment, a vessel, or a piece of furniture, turning it into a bearer of philosophical weight. This movement consciously aligns with post-materialist culture while pointedly resisting the spectacle of luxury branding. In just disrupting, that sort of paradigm of what is what, and how we give labels and values of things, it's also a relationship to how we give value to people and different types of people, and the hierarchy of that. So disrupting that. The terms formation, incorporating the prefix, post to denote a response to or moving beyond the age of material luxury, signifies this critical departure. Crucially, the insistence on functionality is a structural defense against speculative capture. An object designed for enduring use and practical role resists immediate obsolescence and replacement, grounding its value in continued, tangible interaction rather than ephemeral market hype. This depth of thought transforms the object's acquisition from a financial transaction into an act of cultural custodianship, uniting the physical artifact with a conceptual narrative and an immutable digital history. The mechanics of inalienable worth is secured when the object is valued qua artwork, based on its artistic determinants, independent of its utility outside those artistic terms, e.g., a sculpture's value as a doorstop is excluded. This personal intrinsic connection means that if a piece fails to appreciate financially over time, not all is lost. The methodology for securing inalienable value relies on the strategic implementation of intentionality as an anti-market multiplier. If speculative value requires an intersubjective consensus among experts and collectors to establish reputation and future worth, inalienable value must be anchored in the artist's singular, subjective intent. Post-luxury, conceptual functional art defines value primarily through its conceptual foundation, meaning the object must communicate a non-negotiable idea, belief, or critique. By prioritizing the political idea over immediate commercial viability, the artist intentionally creates an antagonism to the market structure itself. This critical commitment acts as a high barrier to speculative entry. The contemporary critical art theory validates this approach, emphasizing how art functions within broader social, political, and cultural contexts by examining the artist's own reflections and explicit commitment to social critique. The non-negotiable intent to protest is in itself the critical determinant of value. I was working on the concept of introducing tarps as a work of art for about 3 to 4 years before I introduced it to the public, and it was really important for me that I was working through this process. The political economy of the hand, craft, labor, and resistance. To fully understand artisan activism, it is necessary to trace the intellectual history that links craft and materiality to political and moral authority. This framework provides the required intellectual architecture to shift value metrics from financial gain to ethical commitment. The utopian impulse of labor and the truth to materials. The critique of industrialization and mass production has a long-established history in material culture. The arts and crafts movement, for instance, generated radical shifts by critiquing the conditions and value of labor, promoting the truth to materials, and associating itself explicitly with socialist politics. This historical impulse, epitomized by William Morris's dream of finding joy in labor, represents an enduring utopian vision for using craft to build a more fulfilling world through ethical practice. While the labor theory of value, LTV, in classical economics sought to explain equilibrium prices in terms of the quantity of socially necessary labor, the philosophical tradition underlying LTV ultimately views human creativity and production as the source of value. In contemporary critical craft, this materialist perspective holds that value is secured through the artisan's physical investment. The challenge, however, is that this labor component is often invisible or ambivalent in the market, a problem David Grieber rigorously explored. Materiality as moral and ethical authority, handmade objects inherently possess a quality that mass-produced goods lack: nuance. They express the maker's skill, and offer authenticity derived from human workmanship and material lineage. In contrast, mass-produced objects gain value through association, brand names or designer labels that connect with personal beliefs, but offer little or no inherent value tied to the object itself. Anthropological analysis confirms that value is not merely sociological or economic, but is profoundly grounded in our ontological disposition towards the material world. The intensive, sensory, and intellectual experience of manufacture is constitutive of the craftwork's perceived value. However, this intensive labor frequently leads to what scholars term ontological insecurity, where artisans express paradoxes, defining their work simultaneously as a necessity for making do, a menial chore, and a dangerously addictive obsession. This ethical dilemma arises because the market often fails to correlate the intensive, skilled practice with a commensurate economic value. Artisan activism functions as the ethical resolution to this dilemma. By declaring the craft labor an explicit act of protest against systemic injustice or economic oppression, the artisan transfers the non-monetary moral weight of the critique directly into the object's material components. The authenticity of the work is secured by this infusion of moral capital, which transforms the material's history, whether weathered by hardship or deconstructed from institutional volumes, into an undeniable, inalienable attribute. Even contemporary luxury brands now attempt to emulate this depth. Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art intensifies this process by substituting generalized heritage with specific, critically charged narrative provenance. Hidden histories, craft as coded resistance. The strategic use of craft as resistance, or craftivism, is a well-established practice centered on domestic arts like needlework and encompasses critiques of anti-capitalism, environmentalism, and social inequality. Historically, this reliance on craft was often dictated by gendered societal structures. Dismissed as a frivolous feminine domestic art, needlework and craft were deliberately rendered invisible from larger political conversations. This perceived invisibility, however, was strategically leveraged by practitioners. The decorative often became subversive, allowing for occulted messages and coded communication. This history confirms that craft, far from being aesthetically passive, has always possessed the potential for political potency and collective empowerment, grounding the contemporary movement of artisan activism in a rich lineage of material descent, a spirit previously captured by movements like art povera. Artisan activism. The explicit protest metric artisan activism emerges as the definitive non-speculative metric required by the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework. It provides a means to qualitatively measure the inalienable value embedded within the object, resisting the fluid, consensus-driven nature of speculative markets. Defining artisan activism and the art of dissent. Artisan activism can be formally defined as the intentional utilization of skilled, material-based craft and process to directly challenge prevailing socio-economic systems, thereby embedding explicit political intent into the physical artifact. This intent, once declared and materialized, serves to secure the object's inalienable value against financial abstraction. The structural necessity of this antagonism cannot be overstated. Speculative value relies on intersubjective consensus, reputation, and the anticipation of future approval. Inalienable value in post-luxury conceptual functional art is based instead on antagonism, the deliberate rejection of that consensus. The true measure of inalienable value, therefore, is the magnitude of the artist's commitment to making the object structurally antagonistic to the profit-driven economy. This radical stance, prioritizing political commitment over financial comfort, is the non-speculative metric. The emotional currency. Rejecting the VIP apparatus. The fieldwork conducted at the Bold exhibition, hosted by the Newfield's Indianapolis Museum of Art, IMA, provided essential qualitative validation for artisan activism as a definitive metric. The research secured explicit validation from two featured artists, Samuel Levy Jones and Carlos Rolón, regarding the necessity of using materiality and craft as a form of protest against the system. Jones, whose deconstructive work focuses on challenging institutional authority, delivered a raw, unequivocal declaration of intent to fuck the system, man, making his antagonism explicit and public. Equally compelling was the confirmation provided by Carlos Rolón regarding the label of artist as activist, which he stated meant more to him than all this. Rolón's referent, all this, was the immediate surrounding context. A VIP crowd of about 100 people invited to the exclusive preview and reception. This moment constituted a decisive, empirical measurement of value displacement. The VIP gathering represented the financial and social capital apparatus, the very mechanism responsible for conferring speculative value and reputation. By explicitly valuing the political weight of the activist identity over the social and financial leveraging offered by the powerful market actors present, Rollon performed a qualitative rejection of the market's primary validation mechanism. This verbal declaration of ideological purity functions as the object's new, non-financial provenance, certifying its critical resistance and securing its worth outside the cyclical demands of the speculative art economy. Case study validation, the critical proof from Neufield's Bold. The works of Samuel Levy-Jones and Carlos Rollon, both featured in the Bold exhibition that centered on artists pushing traditional material boundaries, provide rigorous evidence that artisan activism operates effectively across diverse aesthetic strategies. Samuel Levy-Jones, Deconstruction as Institutional Critique. Jones's practice is centered on confronting structures of authority and recorded history through visceral material critique. His multi-medium piece, untitled 2019, is representative of a decade-long methodology involving the seeking out, destruction and physical skinning of historical and contemporary source materials, particularly law, medical and history books. The process itself is an act of artisan activism. Jones separates the fabric covers from their binding and contents, then collages the weathered, stained skins onto canvas, creating minimalist, patchworked compositions. The resultant work uses loose threads and exposed cardboard supports to reveal the violence and manual process of deconstruction. By discarding the textual content, the codified narrative of power, while preserving the cover, the physical symbol of institutional authority, Jones conducts a physical undoing of the system. This deliberate choice to utilize the physical materials of the system as the medium for philosophical critique fulfills the core principles of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Carlos Rollon, repurposed resilience and cultural sovereignty. In contrast to Jones's structural destruction, Carlos Rollon's artisan activism operates through material resurrection and utopian affirmation. Rollon, a Chicago-born artist of Puerto Rican descent, has focused extensively on exploring themes of identity, aspiration, and cultural inclusion through his multidisciplinary practice. His works, including commissions such as Te Necesito, Estudio, and I Puñeta, Oh Damn, utilized repurposed tarps. These tarps are sent directly to the artist from Puerto Rico, bearing the physical scars of their original use as makeshift roofs following natural disasters. Rollon engages in an extensive, meticulous process of cleaning, described as both a physical and symbolic act of healing and restoration, but deliberately preserves the inherent material imperfections, such as faded patches, holes, and scratches, as a testament to the community's endurance and survival. It's also important that the tarps have a story, so it just depends. I like keeping certain areas. Whatever I get I have to use, I can't change it to make it something that I want it to become. He transforms these utilitarian surfaces through skilled craft techniques, including handmade appliqué and embroidery, elevating them into evocative symbols of cultural pride. Rollon's creative process merges art with activism, telling the stories of marginalized communities by turning materials of hardship into banners of resilience. This duality of practice, Jones focusing on destruction to critique the establishment, and Rollon focusing on preservation to affirm cultural sovereignty, confirms the universality of artisan activism as a framework defined by non-speculative, anti-power intent, regardless of the aesthetic outcome. The decisive moment, the proof of value displacement, the convergence of these two practices at the IMA provides incontrovertible empirical evidence of the artisan activism metric. Both artists, working with radically different materials and aesthetic goals, share the foundational commitment to embedding explicit critique into the object itself, certifying its worth through resistance. This commitment directly counters the reliance on invisible, exploited labor, analyzed in The Missing Mass. The remainder of this study continues at objectsofaffectioncollection.com. This has been a study from the Objects of Affection Collection, a critical art research institution operating under the framework of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Read the full research at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.